שלום לכולם. אני שמחה מאוד להיות כאן היום. קוראים לי יעל ברהמס, אני דוקטור לפילוסופיה ועורכת אקדמית. לפני בערך שנה, איתי, נכון? פנה אליי איתי והציע לי להצטרף לחלק הראשון של תוכנית משוחחת, כדי לכתוב מאמר על פוסט-אמת מנקודת מבט פילוסופית. כשסקרתי את הספרות שנכתבה עד אז, בלטה במקוריות שלה ההתבוננות של פרופסור סטיב פולר על התופעה. כל הדברים שהוא אמר כמעט היו שונים כמעט מכל היבט ממה שחוקרים אחרים אמרו על התחום, וזה כמובן מאוד סקרן אותי. ולכן כשאיתי פנה אליי לפני כמה שבועות וסיפר שהוא מזמין את פרופסור פולר לכנס והציע לי לשבת פה איתו ולשוחח איתו, שמחתי מאוד, ואני מתכבדת להציג בפניכם את פרופסור סטיב פולר מאוניברסיטת וורוויק הבריטית. פרופסור פולר הוא פילוסוף וסוציולוג. תחום המחקר העיקרי שלו נקרא בעברית אפיסטמולוגיה חברתית. אפיסטמולוגיה זה התחום בפילוסופיה שעוסק בידע, ואפיסטמולוגיה חברתית עוסקת בממדים החברתיים של הידע האנושי. והנושא שלנו היום, פוסט-אמת, נופל ממש בדיוק בקטגוריה הזאת, כי פוסט-אמת זה תופעה חברתית, והמושגים של אמת ושקר הם מושגים מאוד חשובים ומאוד בולטים בחקר הידע האנושי. וזאת גם הסיבה שלפרופסור פולר יש נקודת מבט מאוד ייחודית ומעניינת על התופעה, כי הוא יכול להתבונן בה גם בתור פילוסוף וגם בתור סוציולוג. בשנת 2018 פרופסור פולר פרסם ספר שנקרא PostTruth, Knowledge as a Power Game. ובזמן הקצר שיש לנו היום איתו, ננסה לשמוע קצת מהמחשבות המקוריות שלו על עולם הפוסט-אמת שאנחנו חיים בו היום, ואחרי האינטרודקשן הקצר הזה בעברית, אני ברשותכם עוברת לאנגלית, ננסה to keep it simple לכולם, אם יש משהו לא ברור, מקווה שנוכל להבהיר. אני תכננתי להתחיל עם שאלה אחרת. I plan to start with a different question, but since Itai and his fellow from King's College started with the question of what is new, I think that they assume the phenomenon is new. So this is the assumption that we are dealing with a new phenomenon. And they're not alone in this. Many scholars think that post-truth is a new phenomenon. But Professor Fuller, may I call you Steve?
Sure.
Yeah. So Steve, like everything you say is different from the others. You don't see post-truth as a new phenomenon, right? You actually say that those who view it as new get it all wrong, because post-truth did not begin in 2016 with Trump and the Brexiteers. It actually started at the days of the beginning of Western history with Plato and Socrates. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and also to Itai for the closed conference yesterday, which was very illuminating in terms of how people are thinking about this. And perhaps given those of you who are in the room and hearing about this for the first time, one interesting way to get into my perspective is to think about, you saw a few minutes ago the Rand Corporation video about the idea of truth decay, okay, which, to be honest with you, until I was invited here, I hadn't heard about, but I read the Rand Corporation report, which is very interesting. And what I would like you to focus on is, what does that phrase mean, truth decay? What are we assuming here by that idea? And I think the normal way, you might say, the normal way to approach truth decay and to approach the post-truth phenomenon is to imagine that there's been a truth out there and somehow it's being chipped away, you know, like cavities in teeth, like truth decay is kind of a pun on tooth decay, okay? And so you sort of imagine there's a truth out there and it's being chipped away by all these external agents with all their nefarious ways of, you know, intervening in communications and stuff like that. But that's not how I look at it. I think of truth decay as something that sort of happens naturally unless it's prevented, right? So truth decay is kind of like a half-life of something that lived and then dies gradually unless it's actively maintained. And this goes back to the origin of the notion of where we get our idea from truth. And this is why Yale in her introduction was talking about my going back to Plato. Because Plato basically encountered a world where post-truth was normal, right? In other words, multiple competing opinions. If you go back to Athens, the so-called cradle of Western civilization, that's how it began. It was this contested, what we would now call post-truth space. And what Plato realized, some would say quite wisely, was this is unstable, it is unsustainable, and you have to somehow consolidate this. You have to somehow channel this. And it's out of that kind of concern that the idea of truth arose. And it's on the back of that kind of idea that we then get the kinds of institutions that we normally associate with maintaining the truth, whether we're talking about religion or science or the state, right? Or for that matter, broadcasting, understood as it was in the early days of the mass media, where relatively few providers were providing the information and communication for everyone, okay? So that's how, in fact, we got the truth condition, you might say, and that's been the thing that's been maintained over the last 2,500 years through repeated and active institutional effort. But, as it were, the trust in those institutions has declined. And that's already been mentioned, and we can talk about why that's the case. But I think the main point that people should get from what I'm saying is that truth is actually something that has to always be actively maintained because it's not a natural state of the world. It's not a natural state of the world. It is something that has to be consolidated and maintained for a particular reason. Okay? And Plato had a particular vision of the kind of world that would be good to have on the back of this truth. And that's where the knowledge and politics thing gets very intimately involved. And I'll just stop there at this point and let you bring up some other issues.
Okay. So you say that in Plato's days there was a competition over the truth, and even the secondary title of your book says that, yeah? It says post-truth is actually when knowledge is a power game. So epistemology and politics get mixed. So it's a power game over what? Who are the players? What they are competing over? Who are the winners of this game? Okay.
Yes, I'll answer the question, but let me step back just for a moment. The thing that's interesting about Plato is that he actually thought this contested space was a problem. And this is where we get truth from. It's once you see the contested space as a problem that then truth becomes something like the solution to it. Okay? And then the question is, what institutions will be providing and enforcing that truth over time? And this is where you get religion, science, the state, and all those other things coming in. But you have to start with the assumption that what you're seeing happening in the Athenian square, where all these people are contesting their views, that's a problem. That's unsustainable. We can't live like this. So you have to adopt Plato's frame, at least in that respect, to keep on going down the route that we have been going down for the last 2,500 years. And so then there's this question that you raise about, okay, what are the agents of the truth, as it were? And in a sense, the narrative of Western history has been about that, right? Where we have religious authorities initially, and they often, in the case of Christendom, controlled great empires and so forth. And then, of course, in the modern era, you get states, and then science comes in as a kind of The way it gets institutionalized is sort of as providing evidential basis for the state. And so these two start to get very closely connected, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is how the truth regime gets maintained. The problem that we have now is that in the past, the means by which people would get cognitive access or information about these institutions was through the institutions themselves, right? So there would be a very channeled way of doing it. School systems, education, things like that. That would be the only way in which you would find out anything about the sources of this knowledge power that's called the truth. However, once you start to get into this more distributed media environment, which is promoted largely on the back of democracy as an ideology, right? Not just the development of technology, but the fact that we think democratically and we want to empower and enfranchise more people, then it becomes quite natural to think about people ought to have multiple accesses of information by which they can make sense of things in their own terms. And this starts then giving you the kind of distributed media environment that we have, which social media, of course, is the vanguard of, you might say. And so one of the consequences of that then is that people have different ways of accessing and understanding this channel of truth that's been around for such a long time. And one point that I would raise here about this that I think often gets missed in the discussion is that one of the sources, and maybe even the main source, of the lack of trust that we have in authoritative institutions is the fact that we know more about them. We know who they are, we know who the people are. We don't just know them in their capacity as truth producers, but we also know about their personal lives, right? We know about their financial interests. You know, so all of that greater access in a way demystifies the people that haven't been in fact standing for these authoritative institutions of knowledge and power. And it's that access to knowing the source, being able to identify the source, that I think is part of where the breakdown of trust occurs, is by knowing the source. And so this is, I think, a really important issue, and it's not surprising that when Plato puts forth his, republic, that part of the mission isn't just to sort of channel the truth correctly, but also to mystify its origins. So for those of you who've read the Republic, you know it's quite important that the people who are going to be governed by this kind of regime don't actually know how it came from. That there has to be a kind of mystification process. And I think for a very long time there was this mystification process, and I think the remnant of it is the fact that people talk about words like facts and truth as if they're disembodied, right? As if they're just sort of out there and we just discover them somehow. Whereas in fact these are things that have always been actively maintained.
Interesting. Many people try to define what post-truth is, okay? If you go to the literature and if you listen to YouTube, you will hear different kinds of definitions and explanations of the phenomenon, but you again have different thoughts about that. So you actually say that post-truth is not about whether a statement is true or false. Yeah, a statement that Trump said or anyone is true or false, but rather it's about how we determine what is true or false, what are the conditions under which we determine what is true or false, and about who gets to determine the authorities, the judges, the journalists, the scientists, or everyone, because everyone has sources for knowledge and etc. So please.
Yes, I mean, that is in fact the crucial point. So the issue about post-truth, at the end of the day, it's not a matter about, people believe the wrong things, but rather people start to question the terms on which the distinction between true and false has been made. And this goes to the issue of what counts as evidence. I think that would be the most natural way in which people would encounter this idea. What do people count as evidence? I think one of the things that we often underestimate about the role of education historically has been that among the many things that education trains us in is in terms of what do we take as adequate evidence. Both threshold standards of adequate evidence and the sorts of things that count as adequate evidence. And I think that is the kind of thing that the post-truth condition shatters, right? Namely, what the standards of evidence are, right? And you end up getting effectively competing standards. And that there's no longer a kind of natural point of adjudication. And so the crisis over scientific authority is perhaps the place where that gets played out most explicitly.
So what you say is that not only we get to be in we have the democratization of knowledge, but suddenly, which is a good thing.
Yes.
We want knowledge to be spread all over, and everyone has access to knowledge. That is a good thing. But actually, we now have democratization of truth.
Yes.
And this is maybe a bit, risky, because everyone can decide what is true or not.
But see, this is where it becomes important to understand what we mean when we say that, right? What the democratization of truth is. It isn't as simple a matter as people believe whatever they want. It's not quite that simple. It's rather a democratization of the standards by which truth is judged. Right? In other words, people have competing standards, right? So the point is, let's say, let me give you just a sort of example, perhaps because I'm quite familiar with it from my own other sort of areas of research. Creationism, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so creationism isn't just you believe whatever the Bible says, right? And it isn't just people believing whatever they want in terms of their interpretation of the Bible. There are actually standards there, and they're standards that take in kind of established scientific authority, but doesn't give it the same kind of weight vis-a-vis other types of evidence, you see? And that's kind of what the issue about different standards is about. It's not about ignoring evidence, but perhaps not giving it the same kind of weight that, let's say, the establishment would like you to give it. Right? So generally speaking, especially in our media-saturated environment, where people actually do have access to multiple channels of information, the point isn't that people don't know stuff, right? So it's not a question of simple ignorance. It's a much more sophisticated problem of people not weighting what they know in the way that you think they ought to weight it. They don't take it as seriously as you do, in other words. And they take other things more seriously. And it's that kind of weighting. That's the basis on which you then get alternative standards established.
Yeah. Well, about creationism is one thing, but if you want people to vaccinate their kids, then you have to convince them that vaccination is a good thing, right? And if they listen to others and not to the evidence of scientific research, then they don't vaccinate, and we get people sick and die.
Yes, and that's a good example to bring up in this context, because I think the kind of thing that we need to be concerned about with regard to the vaccination example specifically is that actually people failing to vaccinate in the case where the vaccination works actually has knock-on effects to other people. Right? So in other words, the collective effect of certain people doing something different, right? In other words, the collateral damage that might be done to people who do not participate in that decision not to vaccinate is really the thing that ought to be of social concern, right? But that will only actually affect a certain limited number of decisions. This is the point, right? Not every decision that I take as an individual based on whatever I believe in by whatever standards has collateral damage on everyone else. And I think that the interesting struggle facing liberal democracies in our post-truth world is how to make that kind of distinction. What is like the vaccination case and what is not like the vaccination case, where you can actually allow quite a free range of opinions to pursue many different options in the public sphere.
Right. Let me ask you something. There are many people who points the finger, puts the blame on for the situation we are facing, the post-truth, on postmodernist ideas. Itai here is one of them. And he's not the only one, of course. Many others do that. But you think differently again. So what do you think about the postmodernist and post-truth relation?
Well, I would say with a lot of this stuff, when we get into this kind of level of detail about where it's coming from and so forth, the issue is not to dispute the fact that you've raised, but rather to say what kind of attitude should we have toward this. Mm-hmm. So in other words, I'm pretty relaxed with the idea that post-truth and postmodernism have something to do with each other, at least in terms of, and certainly I think with regard to the kind of agents who have used post-truth to their advantage, where they get intellectual sustenance from, I think there is an empirical argument to make that postmodernism has had a lot to do with it. I say this as someone who kind of came of age academically as this period was coming into being and has been in various ways associated with it. I just think whether that is somehow seen as some kind of black stain on postmodernism or something, because I think if you understand postmodernism in terms of what it thought of itself as being about, it was basically carrying on this sort of critical project that was very much part of trying to get at the truth originally, right, through constant processes of uncovering demystification, right, and then you end up getting very close to the source of the things that you yourself in the past would have called the truth. And that's basically how postmodernism ends up leading you to post-truth. And I think it's a perfectly logical process, actually. The question is, what do you make of it politically once it gets out there as part of a kind of public ideology? And I think that's what we're struggling with now.
Right. And that actually leads me to my next question. Maybe our final, I don't know.
Yeah, no, we don't have any time check here.
Yeah, I don't know about the times. But let's continue as long as they let us. So,
this is the last question.
So this is the last question. Yeah. Okay. So my last question. Many sees post-truth as a bad phenomenon, as a negative, that something that we have to demolish, fix, overcome, whatever, you know. But you actually see it as a progressive process, something that can help us better think about the future, move forward our human knowledge, actually as an engine for innovation, right?
Yeah. Since we only have a little amount of time, I'm going to give a relatively brief answer. One is, insofar as we really take democratization seriously as a project of the human condition, where we want to empower everyone and to enable everyone to have access to as much information as possible, there's a sense in which this post-truth thing is inevitable from that standpoint. The other point I would make that goes to this issue of what the truth, post-truth thing has been about has been that Plato, part of the way in which, part of this strategy of truth is to actually restrict your thinking with regard to what you think is possible, right? And so in the book I talk about modal power. Modality is the branch of philosophy that deals with possibility, impossibility, contingency, necessity. Part of what the truth condition is about getting people to realize that reality operates within a very narrow range of possibility. And it's either my way or no way, basically, if you're Plato, right? And that is what the truth is about. And the issue about post-truth is actually to open up the field of play and to say that there are, in fact, more possibilities available, there are more different futures that we can go into, and we're not just tied by what traditionally has been called the truth.
Right, so this is a positive moment to end our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.